They would remember her by a name she didn't choose. Before 22, she had been a hostage, a wife, a mother, a symbol. Tonight, we return to the morning before any of that, when one child carried messages across a river and kept a fragile peace alive. Dawn settles over the James River. Dew clings to rough palisade timbers. Kettles breathe low inside the fort. Across the water, gardens wake. In that narrow distance between banks, a girl called Matoka, later known as Pocahontas, moves with the easy confidence of someone who belongs to both shores. She listens, carries words, and learns the weight of silence. This is not a tale of romance or thunder. It's the slow work of water carried, fire banked, warnings whispered, and trust built one small errand at a time until power decides her kindness is leverage. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet histories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. The morning mist drifted slowly across the James River, carrying with it the gentle sounds of a world that moved to nature's unhurried rhythm. In these quiet waters of early Virginia, where time seemed to pool like the river itself around fallen logs, lived a child whose laughter would soon echo through the halls of English history. Matoka was her true name, though everyone called her by her nickname Pocahontas, meaning little playful one or spoiled child. At 10 years old, she moved through her father's empire with the easy confidence of someone who belonged completely to her place in the world. The year was 1607, and in this sleepy corner of America, the most pressing decision of any given day was whether to gather berries near the forest edge or help weave baskets by the river. Life unfolded at the pace of seasons, and Pocahontas lived within that rhythm like a fish swimming in clear, unhurried water. You know that feeling when you're half asleep on a lazy Sunday morning, and nothing demands your immediate attention. That's how entire days felt in her world, beautifully, blissfully boring in the best possible way. Her father's domain stretched across the Tidewater region like a vast, interconnected web of relationships and territories that would make today's social networks look primitive by comparison. Wahunsinik, known to his people as Powhatan, governed not through force, but through the ancient art of consensus and kinship, kind of like running a family business where everyone actually gets along. From his great lodge at Werovokomoko, he oversaw 30 different tribes, each with their own customs and chiefs, yet bound together in a confederation that had flourished for generations before any European had dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. The empire operated on principles of reciprocity and shared abundance, where corn, fish, and furs moved freely between villages according to need and season. Imagine Amazon Prime, but with canoes and genuine human connection. Young Pocahontas absorbed these lessons simply by watching, the way kids today learn to use smartphones just by observing adults. This sleepy world of gentle governance proved that power could mean responsibility to others, not dominion over them, a boring but revolutionary concept that would have saved history a lot of trouble. The rhythms of daily life in her village followed patterns as predictable and comforting as your grandmother's Sunday routine, but infinitely more connected to the natural world. Mornings began with the soft percussion of women grinding corn, their stone pestles creating a gentle rhythm that mixed with birdsong and the quiet murmur of the river, nature's original white noise machine that put any modern sleep app to shame. Pocahontas would wake to these familiar sounds, stretching in the warm darkness of the long house before stepping into air that smelled of wood smoke, drying fish, and the green scent of Virginia pine. Children in her world learned by doing, not by sitting still for lessons, so her education came through helping with the endless, meditative tasks that kept life moving forward. She learned to weave by sitting beside her aunts, her small fingers fumbling with grass and bark until muscle memory took over and the work became as natural as breathing. There were no schedules, no deadlines, no notifications buzzing for attention, thus the slow accumulation of skills and knowledge that would serve her throughout her life. Think about the most relaxing craft project you've ever done, then imagine that being your entire educational system. The games children played in this American Sleepy Story were borrowed from the adult world, but stripped of their serious consequences, like a prehistoric version of playing house or office. Young boys practiced with miniature bows, aiming at targets made of corn husks while chattering and laughing in the universal language of kids being kids. Girls created elaborate villages using twigs and moss, complete with tiny longhouses and imaginary councils where dolls made important decisions about absolutely nothing. Pocahontas excelled at these games of imagination, often leading expeditions of younger children into the forest to gather treasures out unusual stones, perfect feathers, or shells carried inland by trading parties from the coast. These expeditions taught patience and observation in ways that would make modern mindfulness coaches weep with envy. Children learned to move quietly through the woods, to read signs of weather and wildlife, to find their way home by landmarks invisible to outsider eyes. In a world without Google Maps or GPS, kids developed an internal compass that connected them to their environment in ways we've mostly forgotten. The forest itself served as classroom, playground, and cathedral all at once, nature's original multi-purpose space. The trading networks that connected her father's confederation stretched hundreds of miles in every direction, bringing a steady flow of visitors and goods that added subtle variety to village life without disrupting its fundamental peace. Pocahontas grew up watching these exchanges: copper from the mountains, shells from the coast, exotic foods and tools from distant tribes, like an ancient version of international commerce, but with actual human relationships at its center. The real education came from observing how her father received these strangers, how hospitality was extended without question, how trust was built through meals and patient conversation rather than contracts and lawyers. Trade was never just about goods, it was about relationships, stories, news from far places delivered by actual human beings instead of algorithms and news feeds. Visitors would stay for days, sometimes weeks, sharing not just their wares, but their songs, their techniques for making particular tools, their knowledge of distant lands. In this gentle American story, wealth meant abundance to share, not possessions to hoard in some climate-controlled storage unit. Commerce moved at the speed of conversation, and every transaction came with a story worth telling. Religious life in Pocahontas's world was woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence, as natural and unforced as breathing, nothing like the scheduled, compartmentalized spirituality that many of us know today. There were no grand temples or elaborate ceremonies requiring special outfits and weekly commitments, just a quiet awareness that the spiritual world existed alongside the physical one, sometimes touching it as gently as morning mist touches water. Children learned to recognize sacred places not through formal instruction, but through the subtle changes in adult behavior: the way voices grew softer near certain groves, the way particular stones or clearings were approached with extra care, like the feeling you get when entering a really old library or cathedral. Pocahontas absorbed these lessons unconsciously, developing what would later be called intuition, but was really just careful attention to the nuances of a world where everything was connected to everything else. This sleepy spirituality required no conversion, no dramatic moments of revelation, no life-changing decisions, just a gradual awakening to the mystery that surrounded ordinary life. It was the kind of faith that fits as comfortably as an old sweater, requiring no defense because it needed no explanation. The Confederation's political structure operated on principles that would have seemed impossible to European observers, accustomed as they were to hierarchies based on birth and force rather than actual competence. Here, leadership was earned through wisdom, generosity, and the ability to build consensus among people who were free to disagree. Imagine if politicians actually had to be good at their jobs instead of just good at getting elected. Pocahontas watched her father navigate complex negotiations between villages whose interests didn't always align, seeing how he listened to all voices before speaking, how he found solutions that allowed everyone to save face and maintain their dignity. Decisions were reached not through royal decree, but through a process that resembled family dinner conversation more than corporate boardroom combat. Council meetings could last for days, with breaks for meals and reflection, because rushing important decisions was considered the height of foolishness. In this boring but beautiful system of governance, the chief's authority rested on his ability to serve his people's needs, not on their obligation to serve his ambitions. Democracy, as it turned out, worked better when it moved at the speed of wisdom rather than the speed of anger. Food in the Confederation was abundant and varied, a testament to sophisticated agricultural and ecological knowledge developed over centuries without a single farming blog or YouTube tutorial. Pocahontas learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when corn was ready for harvest, how to process acorns into flour, which wild plants could provide medicine or nourishment in different seasons, basically becoming a walking encyclopedia of sustainable living before anyone knew that term existed. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash grew together in fields that required minimal maintenance once properly established, leaving time for hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild foods that added flavor and nutrition to daily meals. It was like having a garden that mostly took care of itself while providing complete nutrition, something modern permaculture enthusiasts spend years trying to achieve. Storage techniques kept food fresh through winter months without refrigeration, and surplus was shared freely with neighboring villages or stored against future need. In this sleepy abundance, no one went hungry, and the rhythm of planting and harvesting created a calendar that connected human activity to the natural world's own cycles. Meals were community events, not rushed affairs eaten while staring at screens. The social fabric of village life was woven from countless small interactions and shared responsibilities that created a safety net stronger than any government program. Extended families lived in long houses that accommodated multiple generations under one roof. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner, but all year round, and somehow everyone actually gets along. Children belong to the entire community, not just their biological parents, so they grew up with dozens of adults invested in their well-being and education. Elders were valued for their wisdom and experience rather than seen as burdens, and their stories provided entertainment, education, and cultural continuity without needing Netflix subscriptions. Conflicts were resolved through community discussion rather than court systems, and justice focused on restoration rather than punishment. In this American Sleepless Story, social problems were addressed before they became crises, and mental health was maintained through connection rather than medication. The pace of life allowed for the kind of deep relationships that take time to develop and nurture. Relationships that could weather disagreements and difficulties because they were built on genuine understanding rather than convenient proximity. The arrival of strange ships on the horizon in the spring of 1607 initially seemed like just another trading opportunity, albeit with people whose customs were more foreign than usual, like encountering tourists who were really lost. Pocahontas, along with other children, watched from safe distances as these pale, oddly dressed visitors established their settlement on a marshy peninsula that flooding made uninhabitable during summer months. The newcomers' choice of location puzzled the local inhabitants. Anyone who knew the area could have warned them about the seasonal problems they would face, like building a beach house below the high tide line. But in the spirit of hospitality that governed interactions with strangers, food and guidance were offered, beginning a relationship that would gradually draw the curious, intelligent child deeper into a story she could never have imagined. The sleepy rhythms of her childhood were about to encounter the restless urgency of a very different world, where time was money and efficiency mattered more than wisdom. though she had no way of knowing it. Her life would soon become a bridge between two incompatible visions of how human beings might live on the same land, and the boring beauty of her childhood would give way to a story far more complicated than anyone in that peaceful village could have dreamed. The sound of English voices carried across the water on that first spring morning, foreign syllables mixing with the familiar calls of birds and the gentle lapping of waves against canoe hulls. Pocahontas crouched behind a screen of cattails, watching these strange pale men stumble around their new settlement like children trying to play house with rules they didn't understand. Their leader, a stocky man with a beard that would have made any self-respecting beaver jealous, kept pointing at things and shouting orders that his own men seemed to ignore half the time. Captain John Smith had survived battles across Europe, but watching him try to organize a work party was like watching someone attempt to herd cats while blindfolded. The colonists had chosen the absolute worst possible location for their fort, a marshy peninsula that turned into a swamp every summer, proving that even adults could make decisions that would embarrass a 10-year-old. But Pocahontas found their incompetence more curious than alarming, the way you might watch a nature documentary about some particularly clumsy species of bird that somehow manages to survive despite all evidence to the contrary. The first few months of contact unfolded like the world's most boring diplomatic dance, with both sides trying to figure out what the other wanted without actually asking directly. Pocahontas became an unofficial ambassador simply because she was brave enough to approach the strangers and smart enough to pick up their language faster than anyone else in her village. While grown-ups conducted formal meetings full of serious faces and careful gestures, she wandered through Jamestown like a curious tourist, absorbing English words and customs with the effortless efficiency that only children possess. The colonists were endlessly fascinating to her grown men who couldn't start a fire without matches, who wore heavy clothes even in summer heat, who seemed to panic whenever they ran out of the mysterious hard biscuits they called food. It was like watching an entire community of people who had somehow forgotten how to live, and her natural helpfulness kicked in the way it might if she'd encountered a lost puppy. This American sleepy story of cultural exchange happened one small gesture at a time, with a child serving as the bridge between two worlds that couldn't quite figure each other out. John Smith quickly realized that this bright, fearless girl was his best hope for survival, though he probably couldn't have explained why a 10-year-old was more competent at international relations than trained diplomats. She could translate not just words, but intentions, helping the English understand which gifts would be appreciated and which requests would cause offense. More importantly, she could make the colonists seem less threatening to her own people, vouching for their basic humanity even when their behavior suggested otherwise. Smith wrote later that she had wit and spirit that exceeded anyone else in her nation, though he might have been more accurate to say she exceeded most of the English as well when it came to practical intelligence. During those crucial early months, she essentially became Jamestown's unofficial cultural consultant, teaching the newcomers which plants were edible, how to preserve meat for winter, and why building on a swamp was generally considered poor planning. Her patience with these helpless adults was remarkable. Imagine trying to explain basic life skills to visitors from another planet, except the aliens are also completely convinced they know better than you about everything. The famous rescue incident that would later become the centerpiece of romantic legends probably happened very differently than the story suggests, assuming it happened at all. When Smith was captured during a trading expedition in December 1607, he found himself participating in what was likely a carefully choreographed adoption ceremony rather than a near-execution experience. Pocahontas may have played a role, but as part of a ritual designed to welcome him into the tribe rather than save him from death. Think of it as the world's most elaborate naturalization ceremony, complete with ceremonial drama that Smith completely misunderstood. The whole procedure was probably about as dangerous as a school play, but Smith's European mind interpreted unfamiliar customs as mortal threats because that's how his culture typically handled disagreements. Years later, When he needed to sell books and boost his own reputation, the story grew more dramatic with each telling, transforming a diplomatic ceremony into a life-or-death rescue by a love-struck princess. But the real story was probably much more boring and infinitely more wise as sophisticated people using ritual to transform a stranger into a kinsman, with Pocahontas serving as sponsor rather than savior. The winter of 1607 to 1608 tested everyone's survival skills, and it was during this sleepy season of scarcity that Pocahontas truly proved her worth as a cultural ambassador. The colonists were starving, not because food was unavailable, but because they didn't know how to find, process, or preserve it properly, like having a fully stocked kitchen but no idea how to cook. Smith's own writings credit her with bringing regular supplies of corn, meat, and other provisions that kept the settlement alive during its darkest months. She would arrive with small groups of women carrying baskets of food, turning these relief missions into social visits that gradually normalized relations between the two communities. For her, these visits probably felt like bringing soup to sick neighbors, a basic act of human kindness that didn't require complicated political justification. But for the English, who were used to international relations involving treaties, armies, and formal negotiations, her simple generosity seemed almost magical. She had mastered the art of making aid feel like friendship rather than charity, which took a level of diplomatic sophistication that most adults never achieve. The routine that developed during those early years created a rhythm as predictable and comforting as seasonal migration patterns, with Pocahontas serving as the primary link between two communities learning to coexist. She would spend days at Jamestown, observing English customs and practicing their language, then return home to share what she'd learned with her own people. Her reports probably focused on practical matters, which English tools were actually useful, what foods they preferred, how their decision-making process worked rather than the grand historical significance that later writers would impose on these interactions. She was essentially conducting the world's first informal anthropological study, gathering intelligence that helped both sides avoid the kinds of misunderstandings that typically led to violence. The English came to expect her visits the way you might expect a favorite cousin to drop by on weekends, bringing news and maintaining connections that made everyone's life a little easier. This boring but crucial work of relationship maintenance rarely makes it into history books, but it's often what prevents small conflicts from becoming large disasters. Smith's departure in October 1609 marked the end of this peaceful period, though Pocahontas couldn't have known at the time how dramatically her world was about to change. The captain had been injured in a gunpowder explosion, the kind of accident that probably wouldn't have happened if he'd listened to the safety advice that any 10-year-old could have given him. His sudden departure left a leadership vacuum that the remaining colonists filled with men who had less patience for diplomatic niceties and more enthusiasm for simply taking what they wanted. For Pocahontas, Smith's absence meant losing her primary English contact and advocate, though she was told he had died rather than simply returned to England for medical treatment. This small deception would have lasting consequences years later when she encountered him again in London, but at the time it simply meant the end of an era when cultural exchange had been guided by curiosity rather than conquest. The sleepy diplomacy of those early years gave way to a more aggressive approach that had little use for child ambassadors or patient relationship building. The period following Smith's departure became known as the Starving Time, though it might be more accurate to call it the refusing help time, since local assistance remained available to colonists willing to maintain respectful relationships. The New English leadership seemed determined to prove their independence by rejecting the kind of aid that had kept their predecessors alive, preferring to take supplies by force rather than accept them as gifts. Pocahontas found herself caught between her natural impulse to help suffering people and her growing awareness that these particular suffering people had brought their troubles on themselves through pride and poor judgment. It was like watching stubborn relatives refuse medical treatment while complaining about their illness frustrating beyond measure for someone who had spent years trying to prevent exactly this kind of crisis. The easy intimacy of the early period gave way to formal distance, with visits becoming rare and tense rather than casual and friendly. Cultural exchange, which had once felt as natural as breathing, became a calculated risk that fewer people on either side were willing to take. The transformation of Jamestown from struggling experiment to aggressive colony created new pressures that would eventually pull Pocahontas away from her role as cultural mediator and into the darker currents of colonial politics. As the English population grew and their demands for land increased, the delicate balance that had allowed for peaceful coexistence began to shift towards something more resembling occupation than cooperation. The boring work of daily diplomacy, the small gestures and patient conversations that had prevented major conflicts became impossible to maintain when one side began viewing the other as obstacles to expansion rather than neighbors worth consulting. Pocahontas must have watched these changes with the peculiar sadness that comes from seeing something beautiful transform into something ugly through no fault of your own. Her childhood role as bridge between worlds was becoming not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous, as both sides began to view neutrality as a form of betrayal rather than wisdom. By 1610, the innocent days of cultural curiosity were giving way to something far more complicated and potentially dangerous, though Pocahontas couldn't have predicted how dramatically her own life would soon change. The skills she had developed as a child diplomat, language ability, cultural fluency, personal connections on both sides would make her valuable in ways that had nothing to do with her own wishes or welfare. The English were beginning to realize that wars could be won through strategic marriages and political alliances as easily as through military force, while her own people were starting to understand that their new neighbors had no intention of remaining neighbors for long. The sleepy years of mutual learning and gradual accommodation were ending, replaced by the kind of calculated maneuvering that treats people as assets rather than individuals. The stage was being set for a story that would transform a curious, helpful child into a pawn in a much larger game, though that transformation still lay hidden in the unpredictable currents of the James River, waiting to sweep her toward a destiny she never chose. The spring morning of March 1613 began like any other along the Potomac River, with mist rising from the water and the soft sounds of women preparing the day's first meal drifting through the Patawamek village. Pocahontas, now 17 and no longer the carefree child who had once cartwheeled through Jamestown, moved through her morning routine with the quiet confidence of a young woman who had found her place in the world. She had been living among the Patawamek people for nearly 2 years, far from the increasingly tense atmosphere around her father's territories where English demands had grown more aggressive and less reasonable with each passing season. Here, life moved at the familiar pace she remembered from childhood and hurried conversations, tasks that unfolded naturally throughout the day, and a kind of boring predictability that lets you sleep soundly at night. She had no way of knowing that 2 English traders were already anchoring their vessel nearby, carrying copper trinkets, friendly smiles, and plans that would transform her life into something unrecognizable. The sleepy rhythm of her morning would be the last normal moment she would experience for over a year. Captain Samuel Argall had perfected the art of making kidnapping look like hospitality, approaching his target with the kind of calculated charm that would make modern con artists weep with envy. He had spent weeks cultivating a relationship with Jopazaz, the local Patawamek chief, offering trade goods and friendship, while gradually introducing the idea that helping him capture Pocahontas would benefit everyone involved. The plan unfolded with the kind of methodical patience that characterized the best predators, casual visits, shared meals, growing familiarity that made the eventual betrayal seem almost friendly. When Argall finally suggested that Pocahontas might enjoy seeing his ship, perhaps bringing some of her friends for a brief visit and tour of English maritime technology, the invitation seemed natural rather than sinister. Jopazaz, who had been thoroughly convinced that cooperation would bring prosperity to his people, encouraged her to accept this gesture of cultural exchange. It was the kind of setup that works because everyone wants to believe that strangers have good intentions, even when evidence suggests otherwise. The moment Pocahontas stepped aboard Argyll's vessel, the careful choreography of deception gave way to blunt reality as she was informed that she would not be returning to shore. The English had decided that negotiating with her father required better leverage than polite requests and trade agreements, so they had simply taken his favorite daughter as collateral. Argyll explained this development with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that transforms human beings into strategic assets, outlining how her temporary detention would facilitate the return of English prisoners and stolen property while maintaining friendly relations between their peoples. For Pocahontas, who had spent years serving as a bridge between cultures she believed could coexist peacefully, this betrayal must have felt like discovering that your favorite bridge had been designed to collapse. The boring predictability of her life gave way to the terrible uncertainty of being completely dependent on people who had just demonstrated their willingness to lie, manipulate, and kidnap to achieve their goals. Her childhood role as cultural ambassador was over. Her new role as political prisoner was just beginning. The journey to Henricus unfolded like a sleepy nightmare, with familiar Virginia landscapes sliding past while her circumstances became increasingly surreal. She was treated with what the English called extraordinary courteous usage, which meant comfortable quarters, adequate food, and polite conversation that never quite acknowledged the fundamental reality that she was being held against her will. Her captors seemed genuinely puzzled by her lack of gratitude for their hospitality, as if providing decent treatment somehow negated the fact that she couldn't leave. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Grown men who convinced themselves that kindness excused kidnapping, who believed that good intentions justified terrible actions. For Pocahontas, these conversations must have been like being trapped in some surreal theater where everyone was performing a play about friendship while the script clearly called for imprisonment. The English ability to rationalize their behavior would have been fascinating if it weren't so personally devastating for the person experiencing its effects. Life at Henricus settled into a routine that combined the appearance of normal social interaction with the underlying reality of captivity, creating a psychological environment that modern experts would recognize as profoundly destabilizing. Pocahontas was assigned comfortable quarters, provided with appropriate clothing, and encouraged to participate in daily activities as if she were a guest rather than a prisoner. The Rev. Alexander Whitaker took personal responsibility for her religious education, approaching his task with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was saving souls rather than erasing identities. These lessons in Christianity weren't presented as optional cultural exchange, but as necessary preparation for her eventual return to civilized society, with the clear implication that her own beliefs were obstacles to overcome rather than perspectives to respect. The process was designed to be gradual and gentle, like slowly boiling a frog, so that resistance would seem unreasonable rather than natural. This American story of cultural conversion proceeded through patient repetition and social pressure rather than dramatic confrontation, making it harder to identify exactly when voluntary learning became coercive indoctrination. The baptism ceremony that transformed Matoka into Rebecca represented more than a simple name change, was the official death of one identity and the birth of another, designed to serve English purposes rather than personal spiritual growth. The ritual took place with appropriate solemnity and celebration, attended by colonial officials who saw it as proof that their civilization could successfully transform even the most resistant native subjects. For the witnesses, this was a moment of triumph that validated their entire colonial project, demonstrating that English culture was not just superior, but irresistibly attractive to anyone exposed to its benefits. But for the person at the center of the ceremony, the experience was more complicated, a public performance of conversion that may have felt more like a funeral for her former self than a celebration of her new identity. The name Rebecca came with expectations and limitations that Pocahontas had never chosen, creating a persona that existed primarily to make English observers comfortable with their own actions. She was becoming a character in someone else's story, written by people who had never bothered to ask what story she might have preferred to tell. The isolation from her own people during this period created a psychological pressure that would have been difficult for anyone to resist, but was especially powerful for someone who had grown up in a culture that valued community connections above individual autonomy. Letters and messages from her father occasionally reached Henricus, but these communications were carefully monitored and filtered by her captors, who wanted to maintain hope for eventual resolution while preventing any planning for escape or rescue. The English understood that despair was counterproductive. A completely broken prisoner served no diplomatic purpose, so they calibrated her treatment to maintain just enough hope to prevent complete psychological collapse while ensuring that all her remaining connections to her former life were mediated through English goodwill. This calculated management of human emotion was probably more sophisticated than anything her captors realized they were doing, but it was devastatingly effective at creating dependency and gratitude toward the very people responsible for her suffering. The boring routine of daily life at Henricus concealed a systematic process of psychological reconstruction that would have impressed modern specialists in behavioral modification. During the long months of waiting for her father to meet English demands that kept shifting and expanding, Pocahontas encountered John Rolfe, a widowed tobacco planter whose interest in her would soon add romantic complications to an already complex political situation. Rolfe approached their relationship with the kind of earnest internal conflict that characterized men who want to do the right thing but can't quite figure out what that means when personal desire conflicts with social expectations. His letters reveal someone genuinely attracted to an intelligent, beautiful woman while simultaneously worried that this attraction might be morally questionable given their circumstances and cultural differences. The modern equivalent might be falling in love with someone while knowing that the power dynamics make any relationship problematic, then trying to convince yourself that true love can overcome systemic inequalities. Rolfe's internal struggle was probably sincere, but it was also beside the point. Pocahontas was in no position to make free choices about romance when she remained dependent on English mercy for her basic survival and any hope of eventual freedom. The marriage proposal that emerged from this situation was presented as a love story, but the underlying circumstances make it difficult to separate genuine affection from practical calculation on both sides. For Rolfe, marrying Pocahontas offered a solution to his loneliness while also serving the broader English goal of creating permanent ties with native leadership through strategic family connections. For Pocahontas, accepting his proposal might have seemed like the best available option for securing some measure of protection and stability in a situation where all her alternatives were controlled by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use her as a political tool. The romance that developed between them may have been real, but it was also constrained by circumstances that neither of them had chosen and neither could change. Their courtship unfolded within the artificial environment of Henricus, where her daily reality was shaped by English expectations and her future options were limited to variations of cooperation with English plans. Love, under these conditions, becomes difficult to distinguish from Stockholm Syndrome. The wedding ceremony that took place in April 1614 was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy, Christian charity, and cross-cultural understanding, but it also marked the completion of Pocahontas's transformation from free agent to English family member. The event was attended by colonial officials who saw it as proof that their policies could produce peaceful assimilation rather than violent conquest, while her father's representatives may have viewed it as the best possible outcome under circumstances they could not control. For the bride herself, the ceremony must have been a bittersweet mixture of personal happiness and cultural loss, marking both the beginning of a new life and the final abandonment of any possibility of returning to her old one. The marriage created legal and social bonds that would make her permanently English in the eyes of colonial law, Regardless of her own feelings about that transformation, she was now Rebecca Rolfe, wife and future mother. But those new identities came at the cost of Matoka, the playful child who had once moved freely between worlds that now seemed impossibly distant and irretrievable. The tobacco fields at Verena Farms stretched toward the James River like green waves, frozen in time, their broad leaves catching morning light in a way that reminded Pocahontas, now Rebecca Rolfe, of the water plant she had once gathered as a child along different shores. The rhythm of plantation life moved with a predictability that was both comforting and strange, structured around the demands of a crop that required constant attention, but rewarded patience with profits that seemed almost magical to people accustomed to subsistence farming. John Rolfe had pioneered the cultivation of a sweeter tobacco strain that English customers preferred to the harsh native variety, creating the foundation for what would become Virginia's first reliable source of wealth. Rebecca learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when leaves were ready for harvest, how to cure them properly in the drying barns, and why this particular plant had become more valuable than gold to colonists who had spent years searching for a viable export crop. The work was tedious, but not unpleasant, involving the kind of repetitive tasks that allowed the mind to wander while the hands stayed busy, perfect for someone learning to navigate a new identity while processing the dramatic changes that had reshaped her entire world. Marriage to John Rolfe had provided a stability that felt almost surreal after the upheaval of captivity and conversion, though the comfort came wrapped in expectations that sometimes felt as confining as any prison. As Mrs. Rolfe, she was expected to manage a household according to English customs that often seemed needlessly complicated compared to the efficient simplicity of native practices she remembered from childhood. Colonial domesticity involved elaborate rituals around meals, clothing, and social interaction that served purposes she couldn't always understand, like wearing multiple layers of heavy fabric in Virginia heat because English fashion demanded it, or preparing food in ways that took twice as long to achieve results that weren't noticeably better than simpler methods. But these small frustrations were balanced by genuine affection for her husband, who treated her with a kindness and respect that made the cultural adjustments feel worthwhile most of the time. Rolfe was earnest in his efforts to make her comfortable, patient with her questions about English customs, and thoughtful about creating space for her to maintain connections to her own heritage even within the framework of colonial expectations. The birth of Thomas Rolfe in January 1615 transformed Rebecca's understanding of her place in the world, creating bonds that transcended the political and cultural complications that had brought his parents together. Holding her son for the first time, she experienced the universal amazement that comes with realizing you've created a person who is both completely familiar and utterly unique, a little human who would grow up belonging to both worlds but fully native to neither. Thomas represented something entirely new in colonial America, a child whose heritage included both English and Powhatan bloodlines, making him a living symbol of the cultural bridge his mother had become. The sleepy hours spent nursing and caring for an infant provided a welcome respite from the larger questions about identity and belonging that had dominated her life since captivity, reducing the world to the immediate, manageable concerns of feeding schedules and diaper changes. Motherhood offered a role that felt natural and chosen rather than imposed, though she must have wondered what kind of world her mixed heritage son would inherit and how he would navigate the cultural complexities that had shaped her own complicated journey. Daily life at Verena Farms followed patterns that would have seemed familiar to any successful farming family, though the underlying economic structure was distinctly colonial in its reliance on both native knowledge and English markets. Rebecca's understanding of local growing conditions, seasonal patterns, and indigenous agricultural techniques proved invaluable in adapting English farming methods to Virginia soil and climate. She could predict weather changes that European-trained farmers missed, suggest companion plantings that improved yields, and identify wild foods that supplemented the family diet during lean periods. This practical knowledge made her a genuine partner in the plantation's success rather than just a decorative wife, though colonial society rarely acknowledged women's economic contributions regardless of their cultural background. The boring routine of agricultural work, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing created a shared rhythm that helped build intimacy between husband and wife despite their very different backgrounds and the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. The peace that followed her marriage became one of the longest periods of stability in English-native relations since colonization began, though maintaining that peace required constant diplomatic work that often fell to Rebecca herself. Her unique position as both Powhatan princess and English colonial wife made her the natural intermediary when conflicts arose between the communities, though this role sometimes felt like trying to translate between languages that didn't share enough common concepts to make understanding possible. English ideas about land ownership, individual property rights, and exclusive resource extraction made little sense to people raised in a culture of shared abundance and seasonal use patterns. Native concepts of collective responsibility, consensus decision-making, and ecological stewardship seemed primitive and inefficient to colonists focused on individual profit and rapid development. Rebecca found herself explaining each side to the other, often feeling like she was trying to describe color to people who had only ever seen the world in black and white. The exhausting work of cultural translation was made more difficult by the fact that both sides expected her to advocate for their interests while somehow remaining neutral in conflicts where neutrality was often impossible. The tobacco economy that supported their comfortable lifestyle was already beginning to reshape Virginia's social and environmental landscape in ways that would have profound implications for native peoples throughout the region. Successful tobacco cultivation required ever-expanding acreage as the crop quickly depleted soil nutrients, creating pressure for colonists to acquire new land through purchase, treaty, or simply taking what they wanted when negotiation proved inconvenient. Rebecca watched this process with the mixed feelings of someone who benefited personally from a system she understood would ultimately devastate her birth culture. The profits from tobacco funded the comfortable home she shared with John, the education they could provide for Thomas, and the social status that protected her from the worst aspects of colonial prejudice. But those same profits also funded the expansion of settlements, the importation of more colonists, and the gradual displacement of native communities, who found themselves surrounded by plantations where forests had once provided hunting and gathering opportunities. Social life in colonial Virginia required Rebecca to navigate complex hierarchies and expectations that bore little resemblance to the egalitarian customs she remembered from childhood, though her unique status as Powhatan royalty gave her a social standing that most native people could never achieve. Colonial society was obsessed with rank, precedence, and proper forms of address in ways that must have seemed both amusing and exhausting to someone raised in a culture where leadership was earned through service rather than inherited through birth. She learned to host dinner parties where the seating arrangement conveyed subtle messages about relative social importance, to make conversation that entertained without giving offense, and to dress in ways that demonstrated her family's prosperity without appearing ostentatious. These skills came naturally to someone who had spent years observing English customs, but they also required her to perform a version of femininity that sometimes felt like wearing an elaborate costume designed by people who had never asked what she might prefer to wear. The boring rituals of colonial social life provided stability and acceptance, but at the cost of constant vigilance about saying and doing the right things according to rules she had never helped create. The success of their marriage became a source of pride for English colonists who pointed to the Rolfe family as proof that their civilization could successfully integrate even the most foreign elements. Though this interpretation reduced Rebecca's personal happiness to a political statement about colonial policy. Official correspondence from the period celebrates her conversion and marriage as evidence that native peoples could be civilized through proper Christian instruction and exposure to English domestic arrangements. These reports focus on her adoption of European clothing, customs and religious practices while ignoring the indigenous knowledge and perspectives she brought to her new role. The colonial narrative emphasized transformation and improvement, suggesting that her life had been elevated from primitive conditions to civilized comfort through English intervention. But this story required ignoring the sophistication of the culture she had left behind, the violence involved in her capture and conversion, and the personal costs of adapting to a society that valued her primarily as a symbol of its own success rather than as an individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and preferences. The growing tensions that would eventually pull Rebecca away from the peaceful routine of plantation life were already visible to anyone who understood the underlying dynamics of colonial expansion, though the immediate threats remained hidden beneath the surface of daily domestic concerns. English immigration was accelerating, bringing more settlers who had no personal relationships with native communities and no patience for the diplomatic accommodations that had made peaceful coexistence possible during the early years. These new arrivals often viewed native peoples as obstacles to development rather than neighbors worth consulting, and they had little interest in maintaining the careful balance of mutual respect that Rebecca's marriage had come to symbolize. Her own position was becoming more precarious as well, since her value as a bridge between communities depended on maintaining credibility with both sides, something that became increasingly difficult as the interests of those communities diverged more sharply with each passing year. The sleepy comfort of life at Verena Farms existed within a larger story of cultural conflict that would soon require her to play a very different role on a much larger stage. The invitation that would take the Rolfe family to London was already being prepared in the offices of the Virginia Company, though Rebecca had no way of knowing that her peaceful domestic life was about to be interrupted by a journey that would transform her once again from private person into public symbol. Company officials had decided that the best way to attract new investors and colonists was to demonstrate the success of their civilizing mission through a living example of native conversion and assimilation. Rebecca's combination of royal heritage, Christian conversion, successful marriage, and maternal status made her the perfect candidate for this marketing campaign, though no one bothered to ask whether she wanted to serve as the poster child for colonial achievement. The boring routine of plantation life that had provided stability and happiness was about to give way to the demands of imperial politics, where personal preferences mattered less than public relations and individual lives were subordinated to larger strategic goals. The sleepy rhythm of her days at Verena Farms would soon be replaced by the exhausting performance of being a symbol rather than simply being herself, though she couldn't yet know that the journey ahead would cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. The Thames smelled like a mixture of coal smoke, human waste, and something indefinably metallic that seemed to coat the inside of your throat with each breath, creating an atmosphere so different from Virginia's clean river air that Rebecca Rolfe wondered if she had traveled to another planet rather than simply crossing an ocean. London in 1616 was a city of contradictions, magnificent palaces rising from streets filled with garbage, elegant carriages splashing through puddles that contained things you preferred not to identify, and crowds of people who managed to look both prosperous and desperate at the same time. The sheer number of humans packed into such a small space was overwhelming to someone raised in a world where you could walk for hours without encountering another soul, where privacy was as natural as breathing, and silence was never more than a few steps away. Rebecca found herself longing for the boring predictability of Verena Farms, where the loudest sounds were roosters crowing and the tobacco leaves rustling in the wind. This American story of cultural exchange was about to reach its most surreal chapter, as a woman who had already survived kidnapping and forced conversion prepared to become London's most exotic curiosity. The lodgings at the Belle Savage Inn on Ludgate Hill provided comfortable accommodations for the Rolfe family and their entourage of Powhatan companions, though the constant noise of London street life made restful sleep nearly impossible for people accustomed to the gentle sounds of rural Virginia. Carriages rumbled past at all hours. Vendors shouted their wares from dawn to dusk, and the general cacophony of urban existence created a sensory assault that left everyone feeling perpetually exhausted. Rebecca had brought Thomas, now a toddler, and about a dozen members of her birth tribe, including Tomacomo, a holy man tasked by her father with observing English society and reporting back on what he learned. The irony was not lost on anyone that the same people who had kidnapped her were now hosting her as an honored guest. Though the fundamental power dynamics remained unchanged, she was still performing a role designed by others for purposes that served English interests rather than her own preferences. The sleepy rhythm of domestic life had been replaced by a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign where every appearance, every conversation, and every gesture was calculated for maximum impact on potential investors and colonists. The transformation from Rebecca Rolfe, plantation wife and mother, to Lady Rebecca, Powhatan princess and symbol of colonial success, required adopting yet another persona that felt as artificial as any costume she had ever worn. English society demanded that she appear civilized enough to prove the effectiveness of Christian conversion, while remaining exotic enough to serve as evidence of English superiority over primitive cultures. This delicate balance required constant performance speaking English perfectly, but with just enough accent to remind listeners of her foreign origins, wearing European fashions that flattered her figure while subtly emphasizing her non-European features, and expressing gratitude for her salvation from paganism without completely abandoning references to her royal heritage. The boring work of being a symbol involved hours of preparation for each public appearance, learning the names and backgrounds of people she would meet, rehearsing appropriate responses to predictable questions, and maintaining the kind of gracious demeanor that made conquest look like cooperation. Every smile, every curtsy, every carefully modulated expression of wonder at English achievements was choreographed to support a narrative that had very little to do with her actual thoughts or feelings about the experience. The audiences, with royalty, that marked the high point of her London visit demonstrated both the genuine curiosity that her presence generated and the fundamental inability of English society to see her as anything more than a fascinating artifact from an exotic culture. Queen Anne received her at Whitehall with appropriate ceremony, treating her with the kind of polite interest that might be shown to a particularly well-trained performing animal impressive in its accomplishments, but never quite human in the way that really mattered. King James I treated her graciously at a masque by Ben Jonson, though his attention seemed focused more on the political implications of her conversion than on any genuine interest in her perspective on cultural differences or colonial policy. The most telling moment came when neither she nor Tomacomo initially realized they had met the king, since his appearance and manner were so unimpressive that they assumed he must be a minor courtier. This incident, which probably amused James once it was explained to him, perfectly captured the gap between English pretensions and reality that made London society simultaneously fascinating and exhausting for visitors who had expected something more magnificent from the rulers of such an ambitious empire. The artistic representation that would become her most lasting legacy was created during this period by Dutch engraver Simon van de Pas, whose portrait captured both her individual humanity and her symbolic importance to English colonial ambitions. The engraving shows a young woman dressed in English fashion, but with facial features that clearly indicate her American heritage, creating a visual representation of the cultural bridge she had become through circumstances she had never chosen. The inscription identifies her as Matoka Al's Rebecca and notes her age as 21, providing one of the few concrete pieces of biographical information that survives from her own lifetime. But even this portrait, the only contemporary image we have of her, was created to serve English purposes rather than to preserve her memory for her own people. It was a marketing tool designed to show potential colonists and investors what successful cultural conversion looked like when properly managed. The boring technical details of engraving and printing that made such images possible were part of a larger revolution in communication that allowed colonial propaganda to reach audiences throughout Europe, spreading stories about American possibilities that bore little resemblance to the complex realities of cultural contact and conflict. The reunion with John Smith that occurred during her London stay provided a painful reminder of how much her life had changed since the innocent days of cultural exchange at Jamestown, while also demonstrating the different ways that people could interpret and remember the same events. Smith approached the meeting with a kind of jovial familiarity that suggested he expected to resume their old friendship as if nothing significant had happened in the intervening years. But Rebecca's response, turning away, covering her face, and remaining silent for hours revealed the emotional cost of transformations that others had celebrated as progress and success. When she finally spoke to him, her words carried both accusation and sadness, reminding him of promises made and responsibilities abandoned during the early years of colonization. Her insistence on calling him father, despite his discomfort with the term, forced him to acknowledge the kinship bonds that his own culture had created through adoption ceremonies, even as his society had chosen to ignore the obligations that such relationships traditionally entailed. This sleepy confrontation with the past revealed how much damage had been done to relationships that had once seemed full of possibility and mutual respect. The deterioration of Rebecca's health during the London visit reflected both the physical impact of urban pollution and the psychological strain of constant performance in service of goals she had never chosen to support. The city's coal-heated air was notorious for causing respiratory problems even among native Londoners. So, it's hardly surprising that someone raised in the clean environment of rural Virginia would suffer serious health effects from prolonged exposure to such conditions. But her illness also seemed to reflect a deeper exhaustion that went beyond simple environmental factors, the weariness that comes from living constantly as a symbol rather than a person, from having your every gesture interpreted as evidence for or against theories about race, civilization, and cultural capacity. The boring routine of public appearances, formal dinners, and carefully managed social interactions had replaced the genuine relationships and meaningful work that had made her previous roles as diplomat, wife, and mother feel authentic and valuable. London offered spectacle and celebrity, but very little of the human connection that makes life worth living, especially for someone who had grown up in a culture that valued community bonds above individual achievement. The decision to return to Virginia in March 1617 represented both a recognition that Rebecca's usefulness as a public relations tool had been exhausted and a belated acknowledgement that she was genuinely ill and needed to escape London's toxic environment. The Virginia Company had achieved its primary goals. Investors had been impressed, potential colonists had been recruited, and the success of cultural conversion had been demonstrated to influential audiences throughout England. Rebecca had served her purpose as living proof that English civilization could successfully transform even the most foreign subjects, though this success had come at a personal cost that no one bothered to calculate in their reports to shareholders and government officials. The journey back to Virginia was supposed to represent a return to the domestic happiness and peaceful routine that had made her life at Verena Farms genuinely satisfying, despite the cultural constraints that shaped her daily existence. But the ship had barely left London when it became clear that this homecoming would never happen, as Rebecca's condition deteriorated rapidly during the early stages of what should have been a voyage of liberation from the demands of public performance. The death that came at Gravesend represented not just the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of a story that had begun with a curious child, observing strange ships on the James River, and ended with a young woman dying far from home in service of dreams that had never been her own. John Rolfe's record of her final words, "All must die. 'Tis enough that the child liveth," suggests that even at the end, her thoughts focused on Thomas rather than on her own interrupted journey or unrealized hopes for the future. She was buried in the chancel of St. George's Church, Gravesend, where a statue would later commemorate her role in the early history of English colonization, though that monument would reflect the mythological version of her story rather than the complex reality of a life lived at the intersection of incompatible worlds. The sleepy English countryside around Gravesend provided a peaceful final resting place for someone whose entire adult life had been shaped by the restless energy of colonial expansion and cultural conflict. Her American story had ended in the most English of settings, far from the Virginia rivers where she had learned to be herself before the world decided she needed to become someone else entirely. The transformation of Rebecca's death into a romantic legend began almost immediately, as writers and artists found ways to extract inspiring lessons from what was essentially a story about the personal costs of cultural conquest. The real woman intelligent, adaptable, resilient, but ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond her control, was gradually replaced by a mythological figure who symbolized either the noble savage's capacity for civilization or the tragic consequences of cultural contact, depending on the political needs of whoever was telling the story. Thomas Rolfe would grow up in England, eventually returning to Virginia as an adult, but remaining disconnected from his mother's heritage in ways that perfectly illustrated the cultural erasure that his parents' marriage was supposed to have prevented. The boring details of Rebecca's actual daily life or struggles with English customs, her longing for familiar foods and landscapes, her complicated feelings about motherhood in exile were lost in favor of stories that reduced her complexity to simple symbols that could be deployed in service of various political and cultural agendas. The sleepy truth of a life lived between worlds was replaced by the more exciting fiction of romance, sacrifice, and redemption that continues to shape how Americans think about the origins of their national story. As the last echoes of Pocahontas' story fade into the gentle darkness, we're left with something more valuable than any romantic legend, the quiet truth about what it costs to live between worlds that refuse to understand each other. Her journey from Matoka, the playful child cartwheeling through Jamestown, to Rebecca Rolfe, dying far from home in an English inn, reminds us that the most profound changes often happen so gradually that we barely notice them until they've transformed us completely. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in a world connected by invisible networks that would have seemed like magic to people in 1617, consider how Pocahontas spent her short life trying to build bridges between cultures using nothing but curiosity, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to see the humanity in strangers. The boring work of translation not just between languages, but between entirely different ways of understanding what it means to be human rarely makes headlines, but it's often what prevents small misunderstandings from becoming permanent wars. The sleepy rhythm of her childhood world, where time moved like honey and decisions were made through consensus rather than conquest, offers a gentle counterpoint to our current moment of constant urgency and instant everything. Perhaps there's something we can learn from a culture that valued wisdom over efficiency, relationships over transactions, and the long view over quick profits. The American story that began with her curiosity about strange ships continues to unfold in every conversation between people who come from different places but choose to see each other as human beings rather than obstacles or opportunities. Her son Thomas grew up English, eventually returning to Virginia a stranger to his mother's people, a living reminder that bridges between cultures are fragile things that require constant maintenance from people willing to do the unglamorous work of understanding. The bloodline that connects modern Americans to both English colonists and Powhatan chiefs flows through thousands of descendants who probably never think about the 10-year-old girl, whose willingness to trust strangers changed the course of history in ways both beautiful and tragic. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the Virginia darkness, the James River still flows past the places where Pocahontas learned to navigate between worlds that couldn't quite figure out how to coexist. The story continues in every moment when someone chooses patience over fear, curiosity over judgment, and the slow work of building understanding over the quick satisfaction of being right. If you found peace in tonight's gentle journey through America's sleepy past, consider subscribing to join our community of fellow insomniacs who've discovered that the best stories for sleep are often the ones that help us dream of becoming better neighbors to each other. Hit those notifications if you'd like more boring stories that somehow manage to matter. And let me know in the comments what decade or type of story you'd like to hear next. Perhaps something about the quiet revolutionaries of the 1920s, or the small town dreamers of the 1950s who changed the world one conversation at a time. Sweet dreams, and remember, in a world that never stops talking, sometimes the most important stories are the ones that teach us when to listen.